February 16th, 1942 marked the day when America desperately needed a miracle wrapped in aluminum and rivets. The twin-engine bomber that would become legendary sat on the tarmac at Eglin Field, Florida, undergoing modifications that would transform it from a respectable medium bomber into something the Japanese had never encountered. The North American B-25 Mitchell, named after aviation pioneer Billy Mitchell, was about to undergo a metamorphosis that would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare in the Pacific theater. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle stood examining the aircraft with the calculated eye of a man who understood that conventional tactics would not win this war. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor just 2 months earlier had left the American military reeling, desperate for a counterpunch that would restore morale and prove that the United States could strike back at the heart of the Japanese Empire. The B-25 had been selected for this audacious raid, but Doolittle knew these bombers would need more than just the ability to carry bombs. They would need to fight their way through whatever the enemy threw at them. According to military aviation records documented in several wartime analyses, the standard B-25 model at this time carried defensive armament consisting of several .50 caliber machine guns positioned in various turrets and fixed positions. The aircraft featured a top turret, tail guns, and waist positions, giving it reasonable protection against fighter attacks. However, the early models lacked a concentrated forward firepower that would later make the Mitchell a feared ground attack weapon. The aircraft's twin Wright Cyclone engines could push it to nearly 300 miles per hour, making it fast enough to outrun some enemy fighters, but not all of them. The Doolittle raid, as it would come to be known, launched from the deck of the USS Hornet on April 18, 1942. 16 B-25s roared off the carrier deck in a feat that many aviation experts had declared impossible. Medium bombers were never designed for carrier operations, yet here they were, defying conventional wisdom because the situation demanded it. The raiders struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities, causing minimal physical damage, but delivering a psychological blow that resonated throughout both nations. The Japanese military command realized their homeland was vulnerable, while Americans celebrated their first offensive victory of the Pacific War. But the men who flew those missions learned harsh lessons written in tracer fire and exploding flak. The B-25 needed more firepower, especially for the kind of low-level attacks that would define the Pacific campaign. Enemy positions on jungle-covered islands and Japanese shipping in coastal waters required an aircraft that could strafe as effectively as it could bomb. The defensive guns that protected the bomber from rear and side attacks were insufficient for the offensive role commanders envisioned. What the Army Air Forces needed was a B-25 that could fly straight at its target, with guns blazing, suppressing enemy fire while delivering its payload with devastating accuracy. June 4th through 7th, 1942 brought the Battle of Midway, a turning point that shifted momentum in the Pacific. American naval forces destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, but the victory came at tremendous cost and revealed the desperate nature of the fighting ahead. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean contained thousands of islands, many fortified by Japanese forces who would defend them with fanatical determination. Traditional bombing tactics from medium altitude proved ineffective against these dispersed, camouflaged positions. The jungle swallowed bombs, and the Japanese simply rebuilt what was destroyed. General George Kenney arrived in the Southwest Pacific area in July 1942 to take command of the 5th Air Force under General Douglas MacArthur. Kenney was an innovator who understood that textbook tactics written for the European theater would fail in the jungles and islands of the Pacific. He observed B-25s attempting to bomb Japanese positions from several thousand feet, watching as their ordnance disappeared into the jungle canopy with minimal effect. The Japanese had become experts at concealment, turning every island into a fortified nightmare that conventional bombing could not crack. Kenney began experimenting with a radical tactic that would become known as skip bombing. The concept was simple but required extraordinary courage from the aircrews. B-25s would approach enemy ships at extremely low altitude, sometimes barely 50 feet above the water, and release their bombs at such close range that the ordnance would skip across the water like stones, striking the target vessel below the waterline. This technique proved devastatingly effective against Japanese shipping, but it exposed the bombers to intense anti-aircraft fire during the entire approach. The standard defensive armament of the B-25 was inadequate for this kind of attack profile. Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a civilian airline pilot turned military officer, became obsessed with solving the firepower problem. According to historical accounts preserved in 5th Air Force records, Gunn was a brilliant improviser who understood both aircraft mechanics and combat tactics. He had flown in the Philippines before the war and had barely escaped the Japanese invasion, leaving behind his family who were captured and interned. This personal stake in the war fueled his determination to give American aircrews every possible advantage. Gunn looked at the B-25 and saw not what it was, but what it could become. Working in improvised workshops in Australia and New Guinea, Gunn and his team began modifying B-25s with additional forward-firing weapons. They removed the vulnerable bombardier position in the nose and replaced the plexiglass with metal, then mounted .450 caliber machine guns in fixed positions. This modification transformed the bomber into a strafer that could rake enemy positions with concentrated fire while approaching for a bomb run. The results in combat were immediately apparent. Japanese anti-aircraft crews who might have maintained their positions during a conventional bombing run now dove for cover when a modified B-25 came roaring in at treetop level with all guns firing. The pilots and crews who flew these modified aircraft quickly became believers. They reported that the forward firepower not only suppressed enemy defenses, but also boosted crew morale. Instead of passively enduring anti-aircraft fire during an attack run, they could now fight back aggressively. The psychological effect on both sides was significant. American crews felt empowered, while Japanese defenders faced an aircraft that seemed purpose-built to destroy them. November 1942 saw the first large-scale test of the modified B-25s in combat during the Battle of Binagona in New Guinea. Japanese forces had established strong defensive positions along the northern coast, and Australian and American ground troops were locked in brutal close quarters fighting against an enemy that refused to surrender. General Kenny unleashed his modified strafers against Japanese positions, and the results exceeded expectations. The aircraft came in at treetop level, their nose-mounted guns hammering enemy bunkers and supply areas, while conventional bombers followed to drop their payloads on the devastated positions. The success of these operations convinced 5th Air Force leadership that the modifications needed to be standardized and expanded. Pappy Gunn and his team worked around the clock to convert more B-25s into strafers. They developed installation techniques that could be replicated by maintenance crews throughout the theater. The nose modification became more sophisticated, with some aircraft mounting 6 or even 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Each gun fired approximately 800 rounds per minute, meaning an 8-gun nose installation could pour out more than 6,000 rounds per minute into a target area. North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25, took notice of these field modifications. The company sent engineers to the Pacific to study Gunn's work and incorporate the lessons learned into production models. By early 1943, the factory began producing the B-25G model, which featured a solid nose with built-in armament. This factory version mounted 450 caliber guns in the nose, along with 2 50 caliber guns in blisters on each side of the fuselage just below the cockpit. Combined with the top turret, tail guns, and waist positions, the G model represented a significant increase in overall firepower. However, commanders in the Pacific wanted more. The B-25G was an improvement, but combat experience showed that even greater forward firepower would save lives and increase mission effectiveness. Japanese defenses were becoming more sophisticated as the war progressed. Anti-aircraft positions were better camouflaged and more numerous. Japanese fighters, though often outclassed by American aircraft in one-on-one combat, could still inflict serious damage if they caught bombers by surprise. The ideal strafer would need enough firepower to simultaneously suppress ground defenses, engage aerial threats, and destroy the primary target. North American Aviation responded with the B-25H model, which would become the ultimate expression of the strafer concept. Engineering teams designed a solid nose capable of mounting 850 caliber machine guns, doubling the firepower of the G model. The 4 additional guns were arranged in a package that could be installed as a unit, streamlining production and maintenance. This configuration gave the pilot direct control of 12 50 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose and 4 in the cheek blisters. The effect was devastating. Test pilots who flew the H model reported that firing all forward guns simultaneously felt like driving into a brick wall. The recoil from 12 heavy machine guns firing in unison actually slowed the aircraft noticeably. Armament crews had to carefully calculate ammunition loads to ensure the aircraft remained properly balanced. Each 50 caliber gun typically carried 300 to 400 rounds, meaning the nose guns alone carried approximately 3,000 rounds of ammunition. When all forward guns were fired together, the B-25H could deliver approximately 10,000 rounds per minute toward a target. March 1943 brought the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, an engagement that would demonstrate the full potential of the strafer concept and validate General Kenny's tactical innovations. Intelligence reports indicated a large Japanese convoy was attempting to reinforce their garrison at Lae, New Guinea. The convoy consisted of 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers carrying approximately 7,000 soldiers. Kenny saw an opportunity to inflict a catastrophic defeat on the enemy using his modified bombers in coordination with other aircraft. The attack began on March 2nd and continued through March 4th. B-25's configured as strafers came in at masthead height, their nose guns blazing as they suppressed anti-aircraft fire from the ships. The concentrated firepower was overwhelming. Japanese gunners who might have maintained their positions during a conventional attack now faced walls of 50 caliber bullets that shredded everything in their path. Following the strafers, other B-25s used skip bombing techniques to strike the ships below the waterline. The coordination between strafer suppression and skip bombing proved devastatingly effective. According to after-action reports documented by 5th Air Force historians, the battle resulted in the destruction of all 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned, and the remainder who made it to shore without their equipment were unable to affect the campaign. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a turning point in Pacific air warfare, demonstrating that medium bombers equipped with heavy forward armament could dominate both sea and land targets when employed with proper tactics. The Japanese Navy never again attempted to run large convoys within range of Allied air power. The success of these operations accelerated the development of the B-25H model. North American aviation prioritized production, and by mid-1943, the first H models began arriving in the Pacific theater. Crews who transitioned from earlier models to the H variant reported feeling like they had been upgraded from a sports car to a tank. The aircraft was heavier due to the additional armament and ammunition, but the twin-right Cyclone engines provided adequate power. More importantly, the offensive capability was extraordinary. But 12 forward-firing guns were not the limit of the B-25H's firepower. The aircraft retained its top turret with 2 50 caliber guns, providing protection against attacks from above and behind. The tail position mounted 2 more 50 caliber guns for rear defense. Most significantly, field modifications added 2 additional 50 caliber guns in waist positions, 1 on each side of the fuselage. This brought the total armament to 18 50 caliber machine guns, 12 fixed forward firing guns controlled by the pilot, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the tail, and 2 in the waist positions. 18 heavy machine guns on a single medium bomber represented a concentration of firepower unprecedented in aviation history. The B-25H carried more forward-firing guns than most fighter aircraft and possessed defensive armament that rivaled heavy bombers. This transformation from a conventional medium bomber into a heavily armed strafer reflected the unique demands of Pacific warfare. The vast distances, dispersed targets, and determined enemy required aircraft that could fight their way to the objective, destroy it with overwhelming force, and fight their way home again. August 17, 1943 saw B-25H strafers in action during the reduction of Japanese positions at Wuk, New Guinea. The Japanese had concentrated approximately 200 aircraft at 4 airfields in the Wuk area, representing a significant threat to Allied operations. General Kenny planned a coordinated strike using all available bomber types, but the strafers would lead the attack. Their mission was to suppress anti-aircraft defenses and destroy enemy aircraft on the ground, clearing the way for following waves of bombers. The strafers came in just above the treetops, their approach masked by the jungle terrain until they burst over the airfields with all guns firing. The effect was apocalyptic. 1250 caliber machine guns per aircraft poured thousands of rounds into parked Japanese aircraft, fuel dumps, and anti-aircraft positions. The concentrated fire from multiple strafers created a steel curtain that nothing could survive. Japanese aircraft, many loaded with fuel and ammunition for defensive operations, exploded in spectacular fireballs. Within minutes, the airfields were transformed into burning chaos. Eyewitness accounts from surviving Japanese personnel, later documented in post-war interviews, described the attack as unlike anything they had experienced. The sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. Machine gun bullets struck everything simultaneously, making it impossible to determine which aircraft to target or where to take cover. Some Japanese accounts compared the sound to a continuous thunderstorm, with the impact of thousands of bullets creating a roar that drowned out even the aircraft engines. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Over the course of several days of attacks, Allied forces destroyed approximately 150 Japanese aircraft on the ground and dozens more in aerial combat. The strafers proved particularly effective against ground targets, their sustained firepower allowing them to thoroughly destroy objectives rather than merely damage them. Traditional bombing from altitude might destroy 1 or 2 aircraft per bomb hit, but a strafer could engage multiple targets in a single pass. Pilots reported that they simply held the trigger and walked their fire across rows of parked aircraft, watching each one erupt in flames. The tactical doctrine for employing strafers continued to evolve throughout 1943 and into 1944. Commanders learned that strafers worked best in coordination with other aircraft types. Fighter escorts protected the strafers from aerial attack during their vulnerable low-altitude approach. Medium-altitude bombers followed the strafers to attack targets that required precision bombing. This layered approach maximized the effectiveness of each aircraft type while minimizing casualties. The strafers bore the highest risk, flying directly into the teeth of enemy defenses, but their firepower usually suppressed those defenses long enough for them to complete their attack and escape. Maintenance crews developed specialized procedures for servicing the heavily armed strafers. The sheer number of machine guns required meticulous attention to detail. Each gun needed to be cleaned, inspected, and test-fired regularly. Ammunition loading became a major logistical challenge, as a single B-25H could carry more than 5,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Armament crews worked around the clock to keep the strafers mission ready, knowing that maintenance failures in combat could be fatal. The reliability of the Browning M250 caliber machine gun proved crucial to the strafer concept's success, as the weapons could sustain high rates of fire with minimal jamming. January 1944 marked the beginning of intensive operations in the Philippines campaign, where B-25 strafers would prove their worth against increasingly sophisticated Japanese defenses. The Japanese had fortified their positions throughout the islands, learning from earlier defeats to create more resilient defensive networks. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned in mutually supporting positions, camouflaged with elaborate care, and manned by crews who understood they were likely to die at their posts. Against such defenses, conventional bombing tactics suffered unacceptable casualty rates. The strafer offered a solution to this tactical problem. By attacking at extremely low altitude with overwhelming firepower, the B-25s could neutralize anti-aircraft positions before the defenders could effectively respond. The 12 forward-firing guns could engage multiple positions simultaneously, forcing Japanese gunners to choose between manning their weapons and seeking cover. In most cases, survival instinct prevailed over discipline when faced with such concentrated fire. Those who remained at their posts were often killed before they could fire more than a few rounds. Naval targets became a specialty for the strafers. Japanese shipping in coastal waters and harbors presented lucrative targets, but these vessels bristled with anti-aircraft weapons and were often protected by shore batteries. Traditional torpedo bombers and dive bombers suffered heavy losses attacking such targets. The strafer approach was different. B-25H's would come in at wave-top height, their nose guns saturating the target vessel's deck and superstructure. This suppressed the ship's anti-aircraft fire while simultaneously killing crew members and destroying vital equipment. Following strafers would then employ skip bombing techniques or simply strafe additional times, ensuring the target was thoroughly destroyed. A particularly notable action occurred in April 1944 at Hollandia, where strafers attacked Japanese shipping in the harbor while ground forces were simultaneously assaulting the town. According to mission reports preserved in operational archives, the strafers destroyed or damaged more than 20 vessels in the harbor, including several valuable tankers and cargo ships. The attacks were so effective that Japanese commanders reported being unable to evacuate their forces or bring in reinforcements. The combination of strafer attacks and the ground assault resulted in the capture of the entire base with its valuable airfields and supplies largely intact. The pilots who flew strafer missions developed a unique camaraderie born of shared danger. Low-altitude attack missions were among the most hazardous assignments in the air war. There was no time to bail out if the aircraft was hit. Survival depended on the aircraft's ruggedness, the skill of the pilot, and the suppressive effect of the forward firepower. Crews painted elaborate nose art on their aircraft, giving their strafers names like Doris Destroyer, Satan's Mate, and Pacific Prowler. These names reflected both affection for their aircraft and grim humor about their missions. The evolution of tactics continued throughout 1944. Commanders experimented with different formations and attack profiles. Some strafers would attack from different angles simultaneously, overwhelming defensive positions that were designed to defend against attacks from a single direction. Others developed tactics for attacking caves and bunkers, bringing their guns to bear on openings and entrances to suppress fire from within. The versatility of the strafer configuration allowed pilots to adapt to different tactical situations, using their firepower as both a precision instrument and a blunt instrument depending on the target. October 1944 brought General Douglas MacArthur's long-promised return to the Philippines, and B-25 strafers played a crucial role in the liberation campaign. The Japanese had had years to fortify their positions throughout the archipelago, and they were determined to make the Americans pay for every island and every town. The fighting was brutal, characterized by fanatical Japanese resistance and the need to root out defenders from elaborate cave and bunker systems. Air support was critical to the success of ground operations, and strafers provided that support in its most direct and devastating form. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, involved the largest naval engagement of the Pacific War, but the skies above the Philippines were equally contested. Japanese air forces launched desperate kamikaze attacks against American naval vessels, while American aircraft sought to destroy Japanese planes before they could reach their targets. B-25 strafers attacked Japanese airfields throughout the Philippines, destroying aircraft on the ground and shooting down others that attempted to take off or land. The sustained firepower of 18 machine guns made the strafers formidable opponents even against enemy fighters. Ground support missions became routine, but never routine in their danger. American and Filipino forces fighting to recapture Manila and other cities called for close air support against Japanese positions that were often within a few hundred yards of friendly troops. The strafers could provide that support with unprecedented accuracy. Pilots would make their attack runs along axes carefully coordinated with ground commanders, their 12 nose guns concentrating fire on specific buildings or bunker complexes, while ground forces advanced behind the wall of fire. This type of mission required extraordinary skill and nerve, as any miscalculation could result in friendly casualties. Japanese defenders learned to fear the distinctive sound of approaching strafers. The twin cyclone engines produced a characteristic deep roar, and veterans could recognize the sound of a B-25 from a great distance. But it was the sound of the guns that inspired terror. 1850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a noise described variously as a giant ripping cloth, continuous thunder, or a massive drum roll. Japanese soldiers interviewed after the war consistently mentioned the psychological impact of strafer attacks, describing a sense of helplessness against such overwhelming firepower. The effectiveness of the strafers in the Philippine campaign led to their increased use throughout the Southwest Pacific area by early 1945. Every B-25 squadron in the theater included significant numbers of H-model strafers. The aircraft had proven its worth across the full spectrum of missions: ground attack, maritime strike, close air support, and even air-to-air combat when necessary. The versatility came at a cost in crew fatigue, as strafer missions were physically and mentally exhausting. Pilots described the tension of flying at treetop level for extended periods, knowing that any mistake or mechanical failure would be instantly fatal. Technical refinements continued even as the war entered its final phase. Armament crews experimented with different ammunition mixes, loading some guns with armor-piercing rounds while others carried incendiary or tracer ammunition. This allowed strafers to engage both hard and soft targets effectively during a single mission. Some aircraft received experimental installations of larger weapons, including 20mm cannons or even a 75mm cannon in the nose, but these modifications never entered widespread service. The 18 machine gun configuration remained the standard because it worked reliably and provided the best balance of firepower, reliability, and ease of maintenance. August 15, 1945 brought the Japanese surrender, ending the most destructive war in human history. The B-25 Mitchell had served with distinction throughout the conflict, from the Doolittle raid that opened America's offensive campaign to the final attacks on the Japanese home islands. But it was the strafer version, particularly the H model with its 18 machine guns, that represented the aircraft's most distinctive contribution to military aviation. The concept of transforming a medium bomber into a heavily armed ground attack aircraft proved so successful that it influenced post-war aircraft design around the world. Statistics compiled after the war revealed the strafer's impact. B-25 strafers had destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft on the ground, hundreds of ships and boats, and countless ground installations throughout the Pacific. More importantly, they had provided crucial support to ground forces during amphibious assaults and land campaigns, saving countless American and Allied lives. The ability to deliver sustained, accurate fire at low altitude filled a niche that no other aircraft could match. Heavy bombers like the B-17 and B-24 could carry larger bomb loads, but they operated at altitudes that made precision difficult. Fighters could strafe effectively, but they lacked the ammunition capacity and protection of the Mitchell strafer. The men who flew and maintained these aircraft returned home with memories both proud and haunting. They had operated one of the most lethal weapon systems of the war, an aircraft capable of delivering destruction on a scale difficult to comprehend. A single strafer pass could expend more ammunition than an entire infantry company might fire in a day of intense combat. The concentration of 18 heavy machine guns on one aircraft represented a philosophy of warfare that prioritized overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. This philosophy would continue to influence military aviation long after the last B-25 was retired from service. Post-war analysis of the strafer concept revealed several key factors in its success. First was the reliability and effectiveness of the Browning M250 caliber machine gun, a weapon that could sustain high rates of fire in demanding conditions. Second was the ruggedness of the B-25 airframe, which could absorb significant battle damage and still return home. Third was the skill and courage of the aircrews, who flew dangerous low-altitude missions knowing the risks. Finally, the success reflected innovative leadership that was willing to adapt tactics and modify equipment to meet the unique challenges of Pacific warfare, rather than rigidly adhering to pre-war doctrine. The B-25 remained in service with various air forces around the world for decades after World War II ended. Some saw combat in Korea and other conflicts, though never again in the strafer role that had made them famous. Air forces transitioned to jet aircraft that could perform ground attack missions with even greater speed and firepower. The concept of the heavily armed ground attack aircraft lived on in aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, which carried a massive 7-barrel Gatling gun capable of destroying tanks. But the A-10's designers acknowledged the influence of earlier aircraft, including the B-25 strafer, in shaping their approach to close air support. Today, only a few dozen B-25s remain in existence, preserved in museums or maintained by dedicated warbird enthusiasts. Some are still flying, thundering across airshow skies to the delight of crowds who have only read about the aircraft's wartime service. When one of these veterans appears overhead, painted in wartime markings and bearing names like Panchado or Executive Suite, it represents a connection to an era when innovation and courage transformed a conventional bomber into one of the most feared weapons of the Pacific War. The sight and sound remind observers that sometimes the most effective solutions come not from building entirely new weapons, but from creative modification of existing ones to meet emerging challenges. The story of 18 machine guns on one plane is ultimately a story about adaptation and innovation under the pressure of war. It demonstrates how combat experience drives technological development and how creative individuals like Pappy Gunn can have an outsized impact on military effectiveness. The B-25 strafer succeeded because it met a specific need at a critical time, providing American forces with a weapon that could dominate the unique battlefield of the Pacific. Its legacy extends beyond the specific aircraft to the broader principle that weapon systems must evolve to match tactical realities, and that the courage to break with conventional thinking can lead to decisive advantages in warfare.